had a bell, mallet or a bell or something, some symbol of authority. The resume. You're a U.S.
Hey, how are you?
We're going to try it. Okay. I'm going to get you We're going to get started again. Folks in the room can take your seats. We're going to get started on the next panel.
Are we ready to start again?
Yes, we are.
You want me to get them in?
In terms of how we want to operate. So Rubik Chef will be our moderator for this next panel. So we'll welcome him and he will introduce the panel. Thanks.
Okay, hello. My name is Rubik Chef. I'm from the Johnson Space Center. I work active thermal control. Thermal is thermal, right? But we like to put them in somewhat of a box where we call it passive, active, or cryogenic thermal control. But we're here to talk about thermal systems and just lunar environments in general and how they impact thermal architectures. I would like to reiterate what Andy said, where it's really important when it comes to thermal, not only to talk about thermal solutions, but to talk about vehicle level solutions that allow for thermal distribution, right? So you take advantage of waste energy from various locations to help warm or cool whatever's needed in other areas. And so we set up a panel, a really good panel, to help talk about how it's been done in the past, take some lessons learned into account, and also talk about some of the thermal environments that drive us right off the top. So first, just some ground rules on the panel discussion. It's like I said, a quick overview of just our thermal environments that drive us. It'll be it'll hit the high level stuff. This morning, I think Brett did a really good job of discussing some of the specifics about thermal environments and the issues on the lunar surface. I'll have very few lessons learned from the Apollo era, and then even some international orbiting satellites, and then some design considerations as discussed by the panel members. But I really want to press on the open discussion. We want it to be not to talk about what we have experienced through whatever research or vehicle architecture trades we've done in the past, but really talk about some out-of-the-box solutions or out-of-the-box ideas that maybe the audience could come forward with. So I will be specifically talking about the thermal environments, again, at a very high level. Eric Sunada from JPL will bring in a robotic spacecraft perspective. He has led a lot of robotic spacecraft work out of JPL regarding the Mars missions and now the Europa Clipper mission. We have Chad Bauer from industry. He is from Paragon Space Development Corporation, and he'll be talking about the industry perspectives on thermal management when it comes to commercialization. And finally, Kirk Sackleader, he's from Glenn Research Center. And he'll be talking specifically about the thermal wadi, which you guys heard a little bit about this morning through some comments. So jumping right into it, so we've been talking, I like how we've been talking a lot about lunar surface ops, but to get to the moon, you have to orbit the moon a little bit. And when you orbit the moon, there is still a very harsh lunar environment, right? And so I'll go through lessons learned on the next slide, but before you land on the moon, you have to design to potentially orbit above the subsolar point of the moon. And that is one of the warmest environments that an orbiting satellite would see, it absolutely would see for the moon. One of the points in case for Orion right now, they're in the process of developing their vehicle to orbit the moon. That's that new crew capsule that's based off of an Apollo-like look, but on steroids, as they call it. They had the same issues with lunar orbit, and through STMD, we were able to go fund some phase change material heat exchanger work to help work as a thermal capacitor for the vehicle as it would orbit and go through those cyclical environments of hot, cold, and hot, cold. And so, like I said, we talked about the surface environments, but right before you get to the surface, you have to orbit the moon, and that's one of the design considerations that any vehicle will have to take into account when going through their entire mission profile. As we saw this morning, planetary albedo is very low, which means that the surface is essentially like black paint. It absorbs everything it gets from the sun and then re-radiates it back to that vehicle that's on the surface. That diminishes as a cosine function from the subsolar point. Again, as we saw through some of the plots from LRO, from the flight vehicle itself. And then finally, I pulled this from one of my esteemed colleagues that's sitting in the audience, Jeff Farmer, one of his papers in the 90s where he did an empirical analysis to really understand what the lunar surface temperatures were based off of what latitude you're at, from the subsolar point all the way down to the poles. And again, you could see it's just the same thing, right? You have large variations as you move from the equator out to the poles. And if you're looking for global access for your lander or for your rover, you have to design for each one of those bands. And that becomes a very tough thermal solution on top of just surviving the lunar day and night cycles. And so what does that mean? What have we seen in the past? Like I said, lunar orbit, it really did wreak havoc on the Apollo missions. From what I've heard and collected data from, on the Apollo vehicle, when they were orbiting the moon, they actually used something called a wick evaporator to help manage those peak loads at the subsolar point. Well, that wick evaporator actually froze over and did not operate as intended during the first initial missions. And what we found was the crew would come back with colds because they would go through multiple internal vehicle temperature fluctuation from 90 degrees Fahrenheit all the way down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit over a 2-hour span. And that happened for a day on end. And so they'd come back with a really bad cold, and that's because the lunar environment really influenced the internal cabin temperatures. Another scenario, but for a satellite, the Indian Space Agency launched a satellite, an orbiting platform, much like LRO, that actually, I think it was in 2008, where it actually failed a day into orbit because it was going over the subsolar point, and the vehicle temperatures raised more than 50 degrees Celsius, causing instrumentation needing to be turned off, the attitude of the vehicle being changed. It just took away from its capability, and essentially it was, the mission was a loss in the long run. Looking at the surface, Apollo surface operations, an interesting note, right? We talked about craters, but there's also hills and mountains on the not mountains, but at least hills on the lunar surface, and they actually have a pretty big influence on that environment as well, right? So that IR backload off the lunar surface going to the moon has caused, or going back to the vehicle, has caused temperature increases of at least 10 degrees Celsius. And that matters when we're talking about tight temperature control for instrumentation science payloads. Lunar dust has been talked about as well in the previous talks. We've heard a little bit about that. One thing to talk about there is there's two things, right? Lunar dust increases your IR, your absorptivity, your solar absorptivity of the sun's impact on the surface. but it also is a poor conductor. It's an insulator, the lunar dust. And so if you think about it, if you have all this dust on your rovers, as you see in the picture on the top right, you almost are insulating your entire vehicle. So then when you go into a colder environment, you're causing your vehicle to reduce in temperature, and now it's going to be at this reduced temperature for a little bit longer period, and stay that way because you're insulating it. And so now you have to design your materials around withstanding that temperature variation, and then withstanding that low conductivity to help modulate that temperature on the material side. So quick lessons learned. I didn't want to dwell too much on it because we had talked about it this morning, but yeah, those are some of the impacts from the lunar environment, and then the associated lessons learned from that. Next, I'll jump right into, I think Eric's going to talk a little bit about JPL and how JPL has, their thermal architectures have influenced JPL's robotic missions.
Thanks, Rubik. At JPL, we've been focusing mostly on near-term in terms of science that looks at the environment or interior that requires operation both during the day and night. So we're looking at distributed networks, trying to leverage the opportunities that some of these commercial managers may provide us. These are just some of the things that we go through in designing for those cases. First, of course, make yourself warm, survive the night. Decoupling from the environment. That's because we do operate during the day, so we want to minimize the radiator size and also disable it, whether that's done with a device such as a heat switch or an active cover. And also, to give you an idea of the types of energy balance that we're talking about for our smaller distributed network, we're chasing less than a watt. We're chasing hundreds of milliwatts sometimes. So it turns out that the insulation is one of the largest leaks that we have, and getting really effective MLI that tolerates dust and get down to less than 1% leak through it is key. The other rule of thumb in general is that we want to gather a mass of similar temperatures requirements together to help grind out the transient. Granted, the transients are half a month long, but it helps nonetheless. And then, of course, barring that we have cold capable electronics, we're going to have to bring a heater. And so, near term, we always turn to chemical batteries, whether it's a secondary battery, where we have like 150 watt-hours per kilogram, or some of the more advanced primary batteries that around 250 watt-hours per kilogram at the battery level. So we work a lot with the power folks, as was mentioned earlier, and it's a constant trade there. Of course, as mentioned, if we had radioisotope power, that is something that, again, it is an enabling feature. It gets us to be able to survive the night. We've done these things. At JPL, we've done it on Mars. The other one's also with RTGs and reclaiming the waste heat. So, a lot of times on our spacecraft level, we just take called the high quality heat in the RTG that's often at 200C, and just radiate within a cavity. The Curiosity rover, we're actually using a single phase loop to gather waste heat and bring it back to electronics during the night. And some of the really low TRL far out there type things is combustion. If you had extra propellant, hydrogen, oxygen, microcombustors to provide heat. So it's something kind of wild. And the next rule of thumb is don't find shelter. So with our rovers, the idea is to you can't afford to have the actuator to cover your radiator, decouple it, maybe you can drive the shelter, or take advantage of a lander, parking under, or a parking garage that can house several small landers. also going into lunar features like a pit. Building your own infrastructure, the Ys that we hear about here, and also where you can just brave the cold, and of course, low temperature electronics helps. One of the things that we are looking at lately is the trades of distributed network for environment and thermal studies. And on Mars, we were able to do that. We had a passive rover with RHUs. We used heat switches. But the lunar environment, the diurnal, is so much more extreme that that technology would not work with heat switch. So, you know, we did studies, trade studies, and we needed a heat switch that operated about, I'd say, 4 times as good as the one that we used on Mars. And so lately, I just have to show that, you know, one of the things that we've been focusing on is advanced heat switch. That there's a poster over here. You get more details. Dave Funky, can do a turn down ratio of 20 to 1 as compared to Mars, which is over a order of magnitude less performing. So this is something that can enable us to close on a design with batteries at this type of usage.
Okay, so next will be Chad to talk about the industry perspectives.
Hey there, I'm Chad Bauer. I'm Paragon's lead thermal engineer. And I've thrown up some pretty pictures. And I'm not going to talk to you about any of them. Nor am I really even going to talk to you about thermal control technology. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because I was invited to talk about commercial aspects, and I think that's important to stay focused on. I'd like to hear your comments on it. But let me give you a little bit of background to tell you why I did put up these pretty pictures. Paragon's been around now for 25 years in the pursuit of development of commercial life support systems. We like to say that when you go to the moon someday or Mars, that you're going to step off of a vehicle and across the door it'll say life support brought to you by Paragon. That would be great for us. But we've been doing this for 25 years now, and I can't say that we're a commercial company. We don't do commerce, we do contracts. All of these things on this that we've made many CAD figures of and many products of as well. They're all essentially one-off designs. Most of the systems that we have built kind of goes along the NASA adage of how they procure and use things. I heard this recently, and somebody correct me if I get it wrong. NASA buys 5 of a thing. It's 1 to break, 1 to bake, 1 to shake, 1 to fly, and 1 to put on the shelf. And in general, that's what we've done. Now, as NASA has moved us in a direction of utilizing truly commercial partnerships. Of course, SpaceX is a great example. We've got one here with SNC, who we're partnered with. The unit size here is starting to move us in the direction of commercial space. Commercial space is really going to have to get to a commodity level if we're ever going to call it commercial space. I'll give you an example here. For, Ruby, you want to hit the next slide there? Up in the top left is a very simple, ubiquitous thermal control solution and an air conditioning system. And around that small picture is a plot of the population of Phoenix, Arizona. And you probably can't read the bottom there, but that's from 18 commodity level air conditioning systems. And it's that level of utilized technology, and I call it utilized, but it's not emerging technology. It's that utilized technology in a commodity form that has enabled people to move into extreme environments. And we're talking about one of the most challenging extreme environments known to man. We have to solve the problem of going there, of operating there, And we have to do it continuously, and we have to do it on the cheap. I've heard lots of the huge technological challenges that are involved with getting to the moon, staying on the moon. I hear about power, I hear about dust mitigation, another extreme environment challenge. Thermal has its own very large problem to solve. But I think something different about thermal in comparison to some of these other technologies. For thermal, the technology almost in whole already exists. In general, when we talk about solving a thermal challenge in engineering, thermal comes in, and I like to say, we come in as the redheaded stepchildren of engineering. There's a problem, it needs to be cooled, it needs to be heated, thermal guy, come fix my problem. And there is now a repository of these thermal control solutions that are applicable on the ground and in space that, as a commercial technologist, we understand we need to identify and find ways to make systems that are largely modular, that identify and solve scales of problem, and that use technologies that currently exist. Now, the moon is an interesting location because it's sort of missing one of those classic modes of thermal transport. You get in your car, you turn on this giant beast of a power plant, and it creates an incredible amount of heat. And we just blow air over it and it goes away. We don't have any of that in space, right? We're dependent on radiation as both our source of energy and our way to reject that energy. But the solutions, the physics for these problems are well known and can be applied. The challenge is really at the systems level, and I'm sure you can tell us all about the types of systems level solutions that solve these problems. And again, I'm not going to tell you about any of them. There's the solutions for short-term or short-distance conduction, for moving things over larger distances and heat pipes, or pump fluid loops. All these things exist. There are various levels of maturity, and they need to be assembled at the correct scale to do the job. But the great thing about the moon for a thermal problem is that we have all the physics available here. We don't need to have a laboratory on ISS to figure this out. We can develop a cold chamber, we can generate these standardized systems, and I say standardization, I've heard that a lot of times today because I see that as NASA's role in preparing commerce for success. And again, we did see that in terms of folks like SpaceX and SMC. NASA's role is now to, the exploration has occurred. We've done basic exploration of the moon. When we go back, we have to do this in a commercial manner to make it make sense. We can do science on the back end of developing that commerce, or allow some science to bring us to the point where commerce makes sense. But we're going to need commerce to make sense for staying in this region for a long term. So again, I really see NASA's role going forward as taking these lessons learned, generating the standards that are necessary, in allowing industry to do its thing, and I think it will. So with that, I leave that to the open panel for more discussion, and that's his own.
Thank you, Chad.
You can flip a few graphs for me when you...
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So
Okay.
now it's thermal wadding.
All right, so I was given instructions by the organizers to keep this short, and that's sometimes tough for me to do. There are many more things to convey on this subject than I can do here. So I tried to identify a few high points here. All of the concepts I'm going to talk about here, and I'm not even including a lot of quantitative data, but that data is available. All of this work is based on a lot lot of pretty detailed numerical modeling, but a lot of it was also backed up with some experimental work to kind of, you know, keep the modeling relatively honest. There's a lot more that could be done in both cases. I have a couple of names up there of folks who have participated in this work over the years. A lot of this was done like between 2012 and 2010 to 12 or so. So it's been around for a while, and we haven't been able to do too much with it since then. So next slide, please. What underlies this was early thinking in the ISRU community that while it would be nice to go to a particular location and prove, yes, we have water ice right here, to really get a handle on the resource potential of the moon, you really needed to be able to map where these potential resources were in over, you know, perhaps even a regional scale topography. In order to do that, you had to have mobile assets that would move around. And clearly, one of the first things that we thought of was that no matter where you were on the moon, either equatorial or polar, that there were going to be thermal issues. And we realized in looking at what you had to put on a rover to have it survive the night was that a big part of the mass that you'd have on a rover is some kind of energy source or storage device to carry that energy around with you and then consume it during the night. So our thought really came down to, we need to think of a way to offload that energy source or storage requirement, hopefully to a simple architecture that these mobile assets could take advantage of. So that's really a very simplistic summary of the background here. Now, so the idea for the thermal wadis, and I will mention, I told my co-panelists here that the word wadi was misused from the very beginning of this, but it's a catchy word, so it continued to be used. But the idea is to use solar thermal energy to heat lunar regolith and store energy in it during the night. Now the problem is that the loose, dusty regolith has a really horrible thermal diffusivity, makes it a great insulator, but a really terrible medium for storing thermal energy. So our solution was that you simply have to consolidate it in some fashion. There's many possible ways to do this. You can melt it using concentrated solar energy. You can use thermite reactions. You could even mix it with other materials that you brought from Earth, but in some way consolidate it so the thermal diffusivity would be increased. If you melt the native regolith and re-solidify it, you increase the thermal diffusivity by about 2 orders of magnitude, so you really improve things quite a bit. So let me see what I wrote on my charts here. So we improve the thermal diffusivity, and then you've created a thermal mass, and in some fashion you use either just ambient solar irradiation of the surface, or you can improve on that quite a bit if you actually are able to steer reflected solar irradiance onto the material. If you do that, and this is the result of a lot of detailed thermal modeling, if you only need a 50 centimeter thick slab, and if you by square meter or whatever, but 50 centimeters is deep enough so that during a 14-day period you can heat it up to a surface, can be kept to about the vicinity of the boiling point of water, and you can keep it, it stays warm enough overnight so that it doesn't go below the freezing point of water. So you have that temperature range. It requires that you very carefully shield the surface from radiated losses during the night, because that will wipe it out pretty quickly. So the sun tracking actually, I think, really enables that 50 centimeter thickness. And sun tracking would be critical if you're going to employ this technique near the poles, of course, because if the sun does not go overhead, it wouldn't work very well at all. So one approach to creating these thermal masses would be simply to use concentrated solar power to melt the regolith material, We demonstrated this, and other labs have done this too. There's a lab at Goddard that did this as well. You can clearly melt enough mass of the regolith to create a 50 centimeter thick slab during 14 days. One of the studies that we did was of the optical properties of these surfaces, and it turns out that a thin layer of dust on the surface actually helps. It tends to suppress the radiative loss if you have it. So that's actually, probably the first and only thing that will be said during this entire meeting about the dust on the surface. So next slide, please. That's kind of the general concept, but we wanted to talk a little bit about how you would utilize thermal mass that has been used to store solar thermal energy. So we did some studies to look at the design of small mobile devices that were particularly engineered to be able to interface with these thermal masses. So you've got to design, the underside of a rover to be able to somehow couple to that thermal mass. It can be conductive, it can even be radiative, but you have to pay attention to the fact that when it's not sitting on this mass and it's driving around during the day, it's going to be interacting with a very hot surface. And so these rovers have to be designed to not be absorbing heat during the daylight hours. So there's some design challenges that are there. But if you design the vehicles to interact with this thermal mass over the course of a 14-day, and you limit the heating requirement of that vehicle to about 25 watts, these thermal masses can provide that 25 watts throughout the lunar night. So we looked at a variety of different ways to do that. I'm not going to go into all of them now. There's some papers, and we can talk about it afterwards. But you can even have, some rovers that basically drive around and they make new thermal bodies. And so, during the course of one lunar day, they can produce another thermal mass, perhaps, a kilometer away from the last one. So there's a way to gradually build a network of these sites around the lunar surface. And there's other potential uses for this stored thermal energy. We did not go into too much detail, but I think the last time I attended a league meeting, I actually showed this, and someone took me up on this and did an analysis that if you create a thermal mass that you heat with incident solar energy, and half a meter away you create another thermal mass, and you arrange it so it becomes a locally permanently shadowed region. It's sunk a little bit below, so it's only radiating to space. You can have a very cold thermal mass in proximity to a very warm thermal mass. And for all of you that took thermodynamics, you can stick a heat engine in between those two and generate electricity whenever those two things have a sufficiently different temperature. So a little bit of analysis shows that this is a concept that would be relatively impervious to any difficulties with the lunar dust, which is a little different than other solar power generating devices. So there's other ways you can use these thermal masses. So the idea here, and I'll just finish with a repeat of the comment I made. I think one of the approaches to doing resource assessment and scientific measurements around the surface of the moon is to have mobile assets, and those mobile assets have to survive, and this is a way to do it. And the principle is to offload a lot of the energy requirements from those mobile devices to a simple surface infrastructure. So that's all I had to say, and I think we're ready to dive into some questions and discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that wraps up the panel discussion part, but want to reiterate that it's thermal isn't just a self-thermal issue, right? It's a vehicle level issue that needs an integrated solution, which is what Chad and Kurt and Eric tried to talk about there. It's perfectly understandable that we looked at other maybe power systems, right? And then take those power systems and create thermal design solutions around them. But really got to look at it as a vehicle architecture rather than just a specific component and help distribute that load. So, not too much more. I'd like to open it up to discussions. Any questions that anyone has? And there's more cookies outside if no one does.
I have a question. The paper that you talked about with the sintered blocks, was that done on a large scale, as in enough to drive an actual road marine? Has anybody done that in a sized up, full scale?
No.
Mike.
Oh, right. So no, that's expensive.
And who's going to write the check?
Yes, well, we have to, for that to be meaningful, it needs to be done, in a vacuum chamber that can be thermally controlled as well, and that you can have dirt in, and that's a challenge. But what we have done is to use concentrated, sunlight during a summertime experiment in Cleveland, Ohio. Like a half-meter diameter solar concentrator, and it pretty readily melts, a half-centimeter dot of material, and you can, raster this back and forth and sweep some more dirt on it. We had a setup ready to go to do the same experiment in a vacuum vessel that had the dirt in it, but not have the whole system in a vacuum vessel. So that's much cheaper to do. You just have a little container with a window on it. And so I'm quite sure that would work even better, because you would not have all the convective cooling that would reduce the effectiveness of this hotspot from the sun. So that's a long answer to say no. We have not done that full scale, but I would love to demonstrate that sort of thing. There's a lot of practical challenges to make this work. I don't want to minimize.
Yeah, just that the practical challenge is what I'm interested in solving.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we sort of know what a lot of them are. We just need to be able to go and attack them.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And for JPL. I'd like the panel to comment on something rather than my commenting. I'll let you comment on it. When we talk about vehicles, we actually have several regimes of operation that require a combination of power and thermal management. So for some folks, we're talking standalone packages that would require the kind of power you need, relatively small, to operate an instrument during the lunar night and provide power during the day. It looks like potentially a solar battery system would work for that. But generally speaking, would you comment on how close you think we may be to generic solutions in different regimes in any way? So, the instrument package, monitors sitting on the surface, systems that are rover size, and human stations. Thank you.
I think the way I would respond to that is what has been done. And I don't have an answer for each of those scales. One that I can think of that's applicable is operationally responsive space, and the concept of development of the thermal bus for that.
Between medium to large scale can be made. But the small scale, it's probably a different solution, thermal solution, which I think is more tangible today than the mid to large scale extensibility question. And I think it's even standardizable, if that's the word, for the small scale capability. Next question?
Hi, Joe Hamilton, Johnson Space Center. Just had a question. With all the solutions available for thermal energy management, should thermal considerations drive, particularly for human spaceflight, where we pick to land, or can we solve the problem no matter where we pick?
Yeah, well, from the robotic standpoint, yeah, it's it's a big cost difference. That's another thing that usually comes into play. We could survive even tonight, and invariably we have to bring so many batteries with us that there's a thing in the cost cap proposals. So yeah, from that standpoint, if the science can be done equally in a less or more benign environment, costs it's a lot of times.
I think on the human side, on the human class mission side.
So one more comment to that. There's one more ISRU element that is really important here, and that idea that was brought up earlier as with vacuum as a resource. When it comes to thermal control, not having convection be there whether or not you like it, and being able to have high performance solutions that limit and or control radiation and radiation properties gives us a large lever arm that we wouldn't have in a comparable temperature regime on Earth. So that it shortens the complications associated with it. It certainly doesn't solve it. But I think those the existing technologies for insulation, thermal switches, and heat movement management will allow us to close the thermal balance for clarity night.
You made me think of something that I think is worth mentioning here. You don't have convection in external spaces, but in a crewed environment you would have, of course, air, and it would be part of your thermal management scheme. And one of the things that would have to absolutely be incorporated is the fact that you're at 1/6 gravity, and to the extent that you are using buoyancy as part of your convection scheme, you have to pay a lot of attention to that, because it would be a very different outcome. So that's just a sort of a small comment, and that's just for essentially for crewed environments or any enclosed space where you are going to include convective solutions.
If I may make one more comment there. So the one picture I didn't, you guys did, but I did want to point out there was one picture in there that in my talk there at the bottom, that if we didn't have nice participation, I could come back to, but I feel like I need to anyways. One of the last things I wanted to point out in terms of commercial forms is that things are designed to work here, work in a convective environment. I'm glad you bring that up. And we saw earlier the instance of Russian architecture bringing that environment with them. That's something that the Russians have done spectacularly on their own stations. They take things that work, bring them, and they bring the environment with them. And I think that's one of the things that provides a low bar for entry, is just build something that can work here. You're going to pay a mass penalty, but it gets us there. We need to get there to get the experience.
Now?
Yeah. No, you're good. You're good.
Dale Boucher from Deltian. Questions for Kurt. On the thermal body, was that sintered or melted material that you laid down for the body?
The experimental work that we did was, it was essentially sintered. We did not push it to the point where we really had molten pools, except occasionally.
Okay.
We didn't really exhaust all the possibilities here. So, but I will add though that the effectiveness of the, leading to that only 50 centimeter thick slab did require that you really melt it completely and then re-solidify. That's the only way you achieve the improvement in the diffusivity that you would need. Otherwise, it would just have to be bigger, thicker.
And the next question is, to build up that 50 centimeter block, what was your time and energy requirement? How long did it take and how much energy?
We basically gave ourselves the 2 weeks of equatorial lunar day.
So it took you the full 2 weeks to build up that 50 centimeters?
With a very small solar concentrator.
And how big the surface? I'm just trying to get a feeling.
It was not big. I don't remember the dimensions, Dale. I mean, certainly less than a meter square.
Okay, thanks.
Alex, Ignacio, Lunar Resources. Kurt, you also remember that Takashi Nakamura, Super Scientific, had 4 concentrators and light pipes, and he ended up melting within a vacuum. Small vacuum environment, melting the lunar regoliths and melt. So it's, and we also did similar and made lunar glass out of it.
That's right. I didn't mean to imply that hasn't been done. What we were seeking to do, Alex, was to do it in a particular way where we would successively build up, layers, in some kind of rastering fashion. We just wanted to demonstrate the
simple 3D printing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did that in Hawaii with solar concentrators.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Where, Jerry?
Hawaii.
How'd you get there?
On a plane. C-130.
Can you say boondoggle?
Did you say boondoggle?
That's the one. I'm at the pub. So, okay. With regards to thermal management, what is the biggest issue for having continuous operation throughout the night and day in terms of your thermal management? For humans, I'll start off small, all right? For a network, a stationary network, a roving vehicle to go prospecting, and then for a human station. What's the biggest issue that needs to be looked at for that thermal management?
Well, for us, it's the fact that we need to operate both during the day and night is a big driver, having it during diurnal. And it's just the excessive resources that are often needed to tolerate that. Those resources, when I say resources, it may mean that we need nuclear to survive. But even if we did have nuclear, I think we could do it.
So it seems to me to sort of push the question a bit further then, that in order for continued survival of the lunar night, we've got to go nuclear. Am I correct in that? Anybody going to argue with me? Jerry?
No.
Oh,
I'm just getting up.
there's a first. Pam's going to argue with me. But I want to hear, that's what I'm hearing you say, and I want to make sure that I'm hearing you correctly, because I'm
without nuclear, because we're trying to go low cost, small motors. And we did close the design of this new lead switch that it provides enough turn down with the types of batteries we're using. that the design looks like it's close.
But as a mass penalty.
Not
Well,
much.
it's smart size. I think, you know, with packaging.
Under 15 kilograms.
For what kind of thermal transport?
Yeah, we're talking during the day, we're talking 5 to 10 watts of dissipation during the day. And at night, 1 watt type.
So that's not going to be a prospecting rover, then?
Several watts. No, it's not going to be a rover.
Not going to, right? So
But
I mean, I'm trying to get an idea of the scale of the problem here. Some of the things we talked about this morning were prospecting rovers in a permanently shadowed region. We've got a bit of a thermal issue there, got a bit of a power issue there. I'm trying to understand the limitations and the engineering solutions that are available, because I heard, well, we can engineer a solution, but as long as we've got the mass required, we've got the, you said money. All right, we'll print some more, come on now.
seismic stations could work this way.
Oh, I'm sure they could, but
Yeah.
but it's we got to think bigger. We got to think permanent. We got to think field station. We got to think enabling other areas. So if we engineer these systems to survive the moon, they're going to survive Mars. We've just reduced risk for going to Mars.
Right.
So all right. So argue with me.
Well, I will say that there is a significant difference in the environment.
I've heard that before. But what about the
Mars
thermal
has gas.
environment?
It is much further from the moon. They're not the same environments.
Right.
So you can't just transplant one from another. But
Why not?
the short answer is convection
Right.
and
Does
energy
that help?
density from the sun.
Doesn't that help you?
It's a great way to get rid of energy if you want to get rid of it.
Right.
But if you need to survive, you want to hold on to energy. Now, of course, it doesn't get as cold on Mars because of that same reason.
Right.
It's in there holding that energy. So there are trade-offs. But I think you're right in saying it's a good laboratory for going to Mars.
Right.
Once you can develop the operational set off the planet, once you can do your robotics, once you have your power,
Mhm.
once you can demonstrate reliability in life, then I think you've got the majority. And it's just a shuffling of the thermal problems, I
Right.
think, that brings you.
Right. I mean, that's what I'm getting at. We've got a laboratory in our own back garden. We want to go there to explore. We've got big plans. We've got potentially enabling resources up there that we need to go explore. And we're talking about thermal management here, and I want to know that, you know, let's go do it. All right, what's holding us up? What's the big issue? And so that's what I'm trying to get out of this. So it goes into the report that we can actually make some traction here, make something happen.
Well, we can't have that.
You got a credit card? Brilliant. We'll go to the pub now. But that's where I'm trying to push you a little bit here.
I know not nearly enough about human systems in terms of the thermal management issues that are involved in that to address that. But my sense is from the studies that we did that the smaller the overall device, the easier the problem becomes to solve without using nuclear energy.
Okay.
And so from the standpoint, if you have a array of many small vehicles, there's probably a variety of ways to have them survive and do your prospecting, without nukes. I would say something that I don't think I've heard mentioned very much today at all is that there's been a lot of advances in material science. And so there's a lot of materials that may well be more survivable or more robust in the extreme cold environment.
Right.
Unfortunately, you can't make people out of new materials, so that solution doesn't work for that.
We can wish.
So I think part of the solution is kind of multidisciplinary.
And I think that's the point that needs to be made.
Yes.
That we've got a unique laboratory, and we've got a number of things that we want to achieve, and it needs to be. We need to look at it in multidimensional, multidisciplinary, but we need to give examples of what those different disciplines are.
And I just want to add one more thing to the materials. So Clive, I agree with you with the laboratory concept, but what we can't afford to do is to build, $1 billion one rover we need lots of small ones so that some of them can
Yes.
fail.
Yes.
So the ideas didn't work, and we try something else.
Right.
And
We
that's
learn
kind of
from the
where we
failures.
were, that's where we were headed with this thinking, and it's not, doesn't solve everything, but it is an approach, so.
Go ahead.
So being at Lunar Aerospace Corporation, spent a lot of time working with EDA issues, and our present way of managing thermal on orbit and on Apollo on the moon involved essentially dumping to the 3-degree Kelvin universe. You can't do that on Mars. So the PLIS has to be completely designed, and there's a kicker there, and that is that when you go from 1.6G to 1/3G,
There you go.
you go from being able to carry just about anything to really being severely weight limited, on the back weight of the crew. So now you, in addition to having to not be able to use your normal stuff, now you got to build a radiator or something that's particularly heavy when you want to have your placements go ahead. So that is one place where you can't just jump from the moon to Mars.
Right, okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Jerry Sanders. The title of the session is Survive the Lunar Night, or Operate During Lunar Night. However, we saw in the first presentation that during lunar daytime, we have the extreme opposite. During noon, you basically will have a very hard time rejecting heat. And as has been pointed out numerous times, we're talking multiple kilowatts, tens of kilowatts when we have a habitat or a human rover. So when we talk about thermal systems, what are the solutions that you guys see with respect to actually being able to operate under, noon conditions on the moon and get rid of the heat?
So maybe punting the answer, but punting the issue to someone else. But honestly, it's a mass impact. But if you just point your radiators to space, you have your issue solved, right? But I'm punting the issue right now. It's a mechanism issue. It's a dust issue. Still a dust issue, right? I get dust on my radiators. I take a penalty on that. But I could do that, right? I could point my radiators. If I'm a radiator,
radiators that during the day you're basically
point them to the sky, and I'm good to go.
If you're talking about your vehicle, you're radiating from the surface to the underside of this vehicle, whatever that area is, and that's radiating at 400 Kelvin at you. Are you going to have your radiators either much larger, or are you going to have them radiating at a higher temperature than 400 Kelvin so that you actually can dump the excess heat that you're getting pointed at you?
Well,
So it's a big problem.
well, and as you pointed out, the albedo and any hills nearby, if you're perpendicular
I'll get you
to
as well.
the noon, you're still
getting the
you're not
influence off the
radiating
other
to
end.
4 Kelvin.
Yep.
Yes, that's right. So very quickly, I had mentioned creating local thermal masses that are continuously radiating without any solar radiation coming on it. So that is a possible cold sink that you can sit on when it gets warm. It's a pina colada. We won't call it a wadi anymore. It's a
Pina colada.
Oh.
So one perspective I want to put on there, we are masters of change. Humans are. When it gets cold, we put on a jacket. When it gets warm, we take it off. I think it's going to be necessary in these thermal controls to be somewhat of a shape-shifting vehicle. Solar shades, etc., things that can morph their thermal capacity.
I think all this discussion is wonderful, and for Clive and for Jerry's heard me before many years ago. I used to say there are 3 things you need in space. Number 1, electrical energy. Number 2, electrical energy. Number 3, electrical energy. If you make an energy-rich environment on the moon, you solve your problems. We can do that by making solar cells on the moon and storing that energy in a superconducting magnetic field in the Australian shadow craters or in lava tubes, maybe, all over the moon. So if you have enough energy and have an energy-rich environment, you can solve all of those problems. They no longer become showstoppers.
What's the
TRL? But we did thin film growth in the vacuum of space with TRL of 7 or 8. all right? So that's not necessarily a challenge, and we've shown in the laboratory environment all the conflicts that can be done that way. Now, let me add, we've also looked at the analysis whereby nuclear or taking solar from the ground and launching it, that's all linear in terms of capacity and cost. By making it there, it becomes exponential. And now you're talking about factors of 10 or factors of 100 cheaper and lower mass by making it there than by taking it up there. All that's possible in the future, but that's one way to look at it. If you've got an energy-rich environment, all these problems become class 1 problems. You know what they are, you know what the solution is. They're not class 3 problems where you know what they are and you don't know what the solution is.
Thank you. I think that concludes the thermal panel. Please give everyone an applause. Thank you for
Good, thank you. I think what we'd like to do is bring the next panel up and present all of you with the personal challenge of surviving and operating through the rest of the workshop without a formal break. The doors will not be locked, so you can take care of what you need to do. But we'd like to try to keep the audience here as we bring up the next panel. So they'll be taking their seats. And we'll bring up the chart.
We're going straight into the next, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You told me where it is. Can I close that? I used the volume
Hey.
You have to introduce Okay, yeah, I have 2 of them.
Let's know how many panelists.
15 commercial units.
How many panelists do you have?
5. Are there 5 chairs?
Yes, it's called Window 2015. No. It's the very last file.
Okay, we're going to get started with the next panel. I'd like to introduce Allison Zuniga, who's from the NASA Space Portal at Ames, and she'll introduce the rest of the panel. So thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. So we're switching gears now, talking about the business case, and specifically the business case for providing power and other commercial infrastructure services, propellant production. So it's important to talk about the business case so that we can understand what some of the challenges are. Maybe we can try to address them as a group, as a community, and also to discuss the benefits of having commercial services on the lunar surface. It's been talked about earlier that would benefit everyone. That would hopefully lower the cost of conducting missions, as well as reducing the complexity of the missions. So we'll discuss that, and then we'll discuss as well the important factors when analyzing the business case. So some of the factors are production costs, operation costs, pricing, investments, revenue stream, return on investment. So I have here a panel of experts to discuss the business case. All of them have a lot of experience in not only technology development, but as well as running businesses. And specifically, all of them are working on business plans for providing services on the lunar surface. So we'll dive right into it. I'll have the panel members introduce themselves, but I have 2 groups of questions up here. One is for the providers of power services, those that who see themselves as providing power in the future, and then the second set of questions is for the folks that are see themselves as consumers of power. So we'll start with the folks that see themselves as power providers. So the questions to them would be, what power service are you planning to provide? What is the TRL of the power technology you're planning to use? And how do you plan to raise your TRL? And what are the major challenges for closing your business case? So I think Dennis Wingo is a future power provider, so you can introduce yourself and help answer the question.
Hi, Dennis Wingo, CEO of Spectrum Incorporated, a very long time lunatic. Along with some of my friends out there who are nodding their heads.
You cannot find it?
Do you want to go ahead, Allison, go ahead and answer the question now, or just pass it on?
Oh, you could go ahead and answer the question.
Well, the issue is, and this is something I've asked in the questions before to the power group, is that we are vastly underestimating the amount of power we need for any kind of substantial facility on the moon. And there's a huge difference between if I'm a sorting mission doing some science, running a few instruments, versus something that the past two presidents have said, or a couple of presidents' vision for space exploration, and the current one, that we want humans to be permanently there, and we want this to be the beginning of our expansion into the solar system. And I related earlier in 2009, 2010, we built a trailer. We built a 40-foot long, 20,000-pound trailer that we used at Desert Raft for providing power, providing comms. We provided power to recharge the NASA Lunar exploration vehicle or surface exploration vehicle. And that was 16 kilowatts, and they had to charge it over 8 hours so that they could drive it for 8 hours. So that's a lot of power. And so we have to, as my good friend Alex just said a few minutes ago, is that we need to create a power-rich environment. So we designed what we call a power lander. It's about 100 kilowatts of landed power, and this is with the Blue Origin class lander that they have just announced that we can add our payload to. Operating in polar regions. We think, because in business, if you're able to do anything, it's lowering your cost so that you can increase the value provided to your customers. So if you have that, if you have a system, and this is why we advocate, someone asked earlier today, why the polar regions for science? Well, if you're running solar power, which is the only thing you're going to be able to do in the near term, we love kilopower, but if we want substantial power, it's going to be solar, and the fraction is the difference between equatorial region is about 23, 24 kilowatts in the equatorial region versus 67 to 70 kilowatts lunation average, which is a monthly average power. That is hugely significant with exactly the same kind of hardware. So these are the things that we look at, and we want to be able to provide power. We want to be able to, because if you're going to do ISRU, I don't care if you're processing water. If you want to derive oxygen from the regolith, it's going to take a lot of energy, a lot more than what people are saying. So if we're going to do that, we need to look at it now, look beyond just the science requirements, and then come up with solutions that can then be offered to other people who want to do their things. And things like what Alex Ignatius had with his storage looks extremely interesting. And these are the kinds of things that we look at because we want to provide value, so that not only we, but our customers can make money.
Yeah, okay. Dennis Poulos?
Thank you, Allison. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So, just for those of you who don't know me, I'm the jack of all trades, master of none. I started out in the Navy. I've flown airplanes. I worked at Northrop Grumman. I managed DARPA programs. I do rockets. I do all sorts of stuff. I have been dedicated for the last, since 1975 or so, I've been a dedicated lunatic also. And also a dedicated space solar power guy, so yes, I belong to the religion of space solar power.
That's what turned you very wide.
Yeah. The moon is a phenomenal opportunity. And the commercial guys are looking at it hopefully as a phenomenal opportunity. You can take a look, and if we treat the moon like it is the Lewis and Clark expedition, and that's all we're going to do. The commercial guys aren't going to be there, they don't care. You gotta realize that after Lewis and Clark, what really happened to open the West was the gold rush and people looking for a place to grow food. And that's what made the commercial opportunities exist out there. And so, yes, I agree with Clive, we're talking about large amounts of power, and we're talking about global power throughout the entire lunar region. The problem is, I've been hearing today all of the discussions, not just local power, but micro-local. We need to have power at a rover, at a sensor, and that the commercial guys don't care. You guys have been solving that problem for a very long time, and we don't care. But when you start talking about having global power to support human exploration and colonization, now we're talking about something the commercial guys are going to be interested in. And what this gets to answer part of your question there, is what are they really looking for to get the commercial guys interested? George did a phenomenal thing a few years ago in that he was the first one to say, we'll pay this much money for rocket fuel that you mine off the moon. Nobody had ever put a price point there before. For the power guys, I have looked for 15 years and I can't get this is the price point for a kilowatt of power on the moon. And I can't go talk to an investor until I know what that number is. So that's one of the things that has to happen before you can ever expect the commercial guys to give you a hand in trying to figure out how to do the moon. And as we've all heard the implications, we had Apollo, then we had the first Bush, then we had the second Bush, then we had Obama with, we're not going to do what the previous two guys did, and now we've got another guy and we're changing all that again. Okay, so NASA, for a commercial perspective, is a terrible customer. It lasts no more than 4 years, so we need some stability in the marketplace itself. I think that kind of sort of answers your first two questions, what are my perspectives. And oh, by the way, just so everybody knows, the thing that I have been pushing and working the longest, and I'm more than happy to talk to anybody about, is wireless power, which has a TRL of infinity, because God's been doing it for the last, I don't know, since time began. So we know that it works, and I do it optically, and it has a billion%, there's a significant number of effectiveness issues that improve the capability of it, and you could do it globally, and you do it from space in orbit around the moon. And so I can provide power anywhere on the moon, specifically at the polar regions, and you can do it continuously, reliably, and it's something that we know how to do. Okay, so.
What is the range of the power you're talking about?
It strictly depends upon how much power you want. If you want 100 kilowatts, we can put up a set of solar panels in lunar orbit, and we can transmit that power down. And by the way, the enabling technology is not solar panels. Solar panels are terrible. There is work going on today that is called power by fiber, and it's specifically designed for monochromatic laser, and we're reaching efficiencies demonstrated well over 40%, and they have some in the laboratory that are demonstrating efficiencies as high as 68, almost 70%. And by the way, the efficiency just says that you've got waste heat, and isn't that a wonderful thing to have in the dark polar regions? You've got a lot of waste heat that you can use to keep your little vehicle running around and keep it warm. So I can make as much power as you want just by putting up more panels.
I wanted to go down to Mohammed and Rolf, since I wanted to separate the power providers discussion, and we'll get to you, George, for the power user. So Mohammed, you can.
Thank you, so I'm Mohammed Ragab. I work for iSpace. I've started working for iSpace a couple of years ago, and I joined to start a blender development. A little bit of my background. After getting my doctorate from France, I came to the United States. I worked on aircraft development first. I went into launch vehicles. I worked on launch vehicles for a long time. and then I went to iSpace, started working on that. About iSpace, you know, it started with rover only. They were going to compete with the Lunar X Prize, and then iSpace realized that it is not prudent to rely on other people providing them transportation to the moon. So that's where they started their development. They are not about transportation only. They are about wanting to have a moon valley in 2040. So they are about having a cislunar economy that stays. But in the beginning, what we're doing now is developing the lander, and we have the rover, and we're gonna enhance the rover before flying it. In terms of what we can provide, so our plan is to use existing technology. So we start with the solar panels and standard batteries and so forth. The rover has been designed, it's very efficient. It uses the solar panels at an inclination that depends on the location on the moon that it's going to. That is our current technology. We would have to grow if we're going to provide more significant power and try to stay through the night. We would have to grow our lander. Our lander currently has a payload of 50 kilograms. We have to grow that if there is a bigger need. So that's where we are.
Could I just ask a follow-up question, Mohammed? So you said your plans are to provide power. Do you have a range of power that you're planning to provide and a time frame? When do you think that would be available?
So what we're thinking is providing power to our own payloads, like rovers. And we can do that once we start flying. We could fly a couple of rovers, for example, if they are the mass is about maybe 10 kilograms a rover. We can fly a couple of rovers, and we can provide that power.
And then that would be sufficient power to survive the lunar night.
If we do hibernation, so you have to observe the heat. In Japan, one of our employees had worked on an experiment that JAXA did to determine how much they can conserve heat by essentially putting up a tent and being it was feasible. But we'd have to design that. We'd have to design a way, as somebody mentioned a little while ago, we have to change configuration essentially. So after landing, when the night comes, you have to cover yourself with the MLI and try to conserve, and if you have enough battery, you can survive.
Okay, good. Okay, Rolf?
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Rolf Erden, representing PT Scientists, headquartered in Berlin, but also with a subsidiary in Houston, where I'm at very often. So my background is, I grew up in the German Aerospace Agency and ESA. As a dual citizen, I also worked at the Johnson Space Center as a flight controller for over 11 years. And somebody was mentioning earlier the second push coming in, so in 2004 with Constellation happening, I was working lunar lander and Constellation spacesuit system. So where are we today? So this company headquartered in Berlin, we too are developing a lunar lander. Obviously it's a key piece of infrastructure and missing link. And the way PTS started out, I wasn't part of it, and it's their first major partner, other than the space agencies, was Audi, so a big car manufacturer. And I'm saying sponsor, that's not true, because they're really a technical partner. So they were heavily involved in the design of the vehicles. So of course they don't have space knowledge, so that came from DLR for the thermal vacuum testing. So yeah, the rovers, as complex a lunar rover can be, of course, it's not the complexity of the lander. So we're working the lander. So the rovers can be, but they don't have to be part of the entire architecture. Obviously, we're planning several missions First one with the rovers, but then there's so many scenarios out there. So what's really elating is that we do have a lot of customers from outside the space agencies who are really interested in getting involved. And some of them experts as far as power, thermal questions go, and some of them not. So we have to basically sometimes hold their horses and explain to them that it's a lot of factors involved in flying a mission, where you land, what is your ability going to be to generate power. I mean, we are heavily relying on solar power, so yes, there are future outlooks, but certainly our ability to recharge the batteries at the angles we're going to be able to get. And so I mean, you are expert, so I don't have to explain that. But what is kind of interesting is, so most of the folks here have some space agency background or have been working with them. So a lot of our customers really, they don't know anything, but they do want to be involved. So that's great. There is truly a market evolving, and I can attest to that. I mean, I'm sure it's true for other companies on the commercial side also. So it's not the same old people or companies or agencies involved. It's very fresh folks, fresh money. That's important. So you're not dependent to be sitting on one pillar of money supply, right? I mean, it's great to receive government money, but it's just better to have a mix of funds. So if whatever funds dry up, you still can progress. So I'll leave it at that. Just hand on to the next person.
Well, I wanted to follow up on Rafa. And I did ask, what do you think is the major challenge for closing your business case?
Closing the business case. Closing the business. I mean, really, you hear that over and over. Also, when we talk to investors, the business case, there's really so many angles in a business case. So, I mean, to give you the best example, let's say some billionaire is there and he knows nothing. Well, that's your business case, right? He just wants to. He realizes when he dies and the coffin doesn't have any shelves, right? And he can't take it with him. So that's your business case right there. Somebody helping somebody still to do something useful with his money in his lifetime. That's the easiest case, right? But then it gets very complicated. Like some investors, they have very specific technical perceptions of what they want to do on the moon. So, and it's very different also what we originally thought. So, just like every head in this room has a different perception of what the future on the moon is going to be like. And earlier it was mentioned, well, how the West was won. Well, nobody back then knew exactly how this is all going to pan out. It's once you bring that infrastructure in place, and there's no golden path how to do that. It's just there will be one new technology tipping off a whole spectrum of others, and that's how it's going to go, and it's going to go from there. I mean, the sure thing is that it's happening, and this is actually the time where it is happening. I'm totally confident. So, business case, we have so many people who already are partners, who want to become partners, either technical partners or investment partners, or sometimes it's just advertising. There's a whole spectrum of business cases. So, and so far, I mean, obviously more is better, but we're not struggling, so that's good.
Okay, thanks. That's George.
Hang on, before you go to George,
go ahead,
Dennis sparked something. We would sell power on the lunar surface for no more than $100 to $150 dollars per kilowatt hour. And to compare that on the Earth, and the United States military is paying $30 a kilowatt hour in Afghanistan. So that's only 5 times more than what we're paying for on Earth in a remote situation.
Okay, I think a lot of you know me. I'm George Sowers. I'm currently with Colorado School of Mines, where we have launched the world's first graduate program in space resources. So if you're interested in a graduate degree, talk to me or on now. Before that, I was 30 years in the aerospace industry, in the rocket business. I retired from the United Launch Alliance about 1.5 years ago. And as Dennis mentioned, we've spent a lot of time thinking about propellant, in particular liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen propellants, which you can get from water. Because United Launch Alliance, at the time I left, was developing stages that could be fully reused if they could be refueled. And so if you have those, then the next thing you're looking for is a source of fuel. And we actually, as Dennis mentioned a couple of years ago, stood in front of the space mining community and offered to buy propellant for certain prices. It was sort of transformational, I think, to that industry, to suddenly have a customer. Because if you want to have a viable business, and all of you aspiring entrepreneurs, write this down, your revenues should exceed your costs. It's that simple, and that's what it means to have a business case, and Allison's already put that up there. So we looked at the problem of propellant from both sides. ULA had a demand for propellant that was based on moving satellites from low Earth orbit to geosynchronous orbit, which is an existing market. It wasn't, we didn't want to jump in and build fictitious markets, because then those markets have to materialize before you can do anything. When I got to Colorado School of Mines, that's the revenue side of it. So ULA is willing to buy, and it shows it on the left-hand column only, the commercial only, 1,100 metric tons of propellant on the surface, delivering on the surface of the moon for $500 a kilogram. That was the prices we set a couple of years ago. Those need to exceed the cost. So the question becomes, can you produce propellant on the moon for $500 a kilogram or less? If you can, you meet the first criteria of having a viable business. We did some architecture studies at the School of Mines and came up with some interesting approaches and estimated some costs. And as it turns out, $2.5 billion, $1.5 billion for hardware development and production cost, and $1 billion to get it to the moon and to place it. And that actually generates an internal rate of return of 9%. So that's a fancy way of saying revenues exceed costs, even when you discount those based on time. We also took a look at a public-private partnership, because having one customer is great, having two customers even better. NASA in the ISRU BAA that came out last year stated a provisional need of 100 tons of propellant per year on the surface of the moon, and this is to get vehicles off the moon and up to the gateway and back. We added that into the demand side of the model, scaled up the production to meet that, and assumed that NASA would be willing to invest $800 million in the development of this system for propellant. $800 million was kind of pulled out of the air, but it's commensurate with what NASA invested in the COTS program, for ISS services, cargo services. And lo and behold, that pops the internal rate of return up to around 16%, which is starting to approach the threshold where venture capitalists or other kinds of investors would be interested. 9%'s positive, but it's kind of marginal given the risk. You'd love 9% on your bank account, but if you're risking your investment on the moon, that's probably not enough. So then you ask yourself, what would, okay, so this gives you the cash flows. This is basically just the cumulative amount of money that's going in and out of your bank account. And sadly, most aerospace ventures look like this. There's a huge, all the investment comes up front, and then you're hoping, down the road to make money back. And you can see the difference between the commercial only and the commercial plus NASA business cases. Obviously, it's much better if NASA jumps in and participates. But these kinds of cash flow curves are very typical in the mining industry or the oil and gas industry, where you have a lot of investment up front and you're counting on revenue streams over a long period of time on the back end. The difference between something like this and the traditional mining industry or oil and gas industry is that they know their markets very well. They understand the commodity markets, they understand their costs very well. So, the key thing in getting something like this off the ground is to buy down the risks. So the conservative investors in the mining industry and oil and gas industry could step in. Why would NASA want to invest? If they had to deliver all that propellant from Earth to the surface of the moon for their asset, like we did in Apollo, rough numbers, $35,000 a kilogram, it would cost them $3.5 billion per year to do that. At $500 a kilogram, they could buy that propellant on the surface of the moon from a commercial company for $50 million. That's $2.5 billion savings just in that first year, including the $800 million initial investment. Just for grins, I calculated the internal rate of return on that, 80%. That's an annual rate of return to the taxpayer. Pretty outstanding. If somebody from NASA, is listening, you may want to start thinking about stuff like this. And just to kind of give you an idea what the architecture would look like, my current favorite crater is Shoemaker. Looks like there's a lot of ice there, but we were using reflected sunlight as the power source. Giant heliostats up there, reflecting down. It's powering an electrolysis plant and purification plant, but it's also using sunlight to directly heat the surface of the moon to sublimate vapor to capture in that sort of dome-like structure that you see in the front there. So business cases do exist and can close for the moon.
Okay, thank you. I think now we can open it up to Q&A from the audience.
George, Alex, Ignacio, this works. So did you include the cost of energy, and how did you get the energy to do that process?
So
that's electrolysis. It's expensive.
Yeah. So the sunlight's doing two jobs. One is directly sublimating the ice from the surface. The other job is powering some photovoltaics to do the electrolysis. And just to emphasize Dennis's point, the power plant or the propellant production plant that we estimated was on the order of 2.5 megawatts power supply required.
And so that's not in your number because
that is in the numbers.
It doesn't compute. Well, we can talk offline, but
so the masses of those heliostats was part of our analysis.
But if you're talking about 2.5 megawatts of solar to launch to the moon and in placing, that's a very significant number. I don't see it in there, but we can talk offline.
Yeah. So 29 tons was the total mass of our system.
We'll check.
Okay.
Hello, Jeff Van Cleve of All Aerospace again. You spoke of the moon as if it were a single place, so you're going to generate propellant in some place. But NASA may not necessarily need those 100 tons of propellant at that place. They might want it at the poles, the far side, some other place. How do you incorporate that twist in your economic case? Because then there's a transportation cost to get fuel from one place on the moon where it's made to where it's needed.
Yeah, I mean that would have to be accounted for in NASA's cost. So the propellant production that we talked about here would be the delivery point would be at within the PSR that you're mining. So if you want it somewhere else, you got to transport it to somewhere else.
Well, that sounds like an interesting little study in itself. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean ULA was transporting it from there to low Earth orbit.
Go ahead, question.
There's 4 other people on it.
Some of you mentioned wanting one big customer, talking about a big facility, but some of the things that we need to do, not just for the science community, but for reconnaissance, distributed network would be a very good idea. So the question I have for you is, considering a model of distributed customers, which can still look at the power grids and the wireless communication models can provide services for a wide number of customers, how do you see that twist in your model in terms of providing a lot, but having it distributed.
Yeah, specifically, that's what I'm interested in. You could put the nuclear stuff down in one place, and you could sort of operate from there if you want to hang on the Schumacher crater rim. But I don't think that's what we want to do. I think we want to be able to rove around and do things in different places. And by providing the energy from orbit with the ability to see a lot of different places, you can use fast steering mirrors, a lot of different things. And you can sit and support a number of customers. I don't want one customer. I want 500 customers. I want 1,000 customers. Like I said, NASA's a great bunch of people, but it's one customer and they can go away in a hurry. I'm looking at business. So that's the kind of thing where, yes, you want to be able to distribute it. By the way, modulating that optical signal, you can get communication. So Dennis and Jay Penn and I were sitting around at John Makin's Fresh Look study many, many years ago, and Dennis said, you know, power is interesting, but if you modulate that signal, that's where you can really make money. And so yes, it also provides wireless communications, and you can do both with one fingertip.
Yeah, and one thing the science community could actually think about is take a look at all the rovers. Opportunity just died because its solar panels got covered up in the dust storm. And you have these the rovers, whether it's the moon, Mars, there's only so much solar array you can carry, which limits your mobility, which limits your science payload. Think about if you could offload that problem to a provider. And in my case, I'm sitting here thinking about it, $100 or $150 a kilowatt hour. And if you needed 10 kilowatts, there it is. If you need 50 kilowatts, there it is. And so that starts you to change how you think about the design of your rovers, your science payloads, your experiments, because you're not having to always build an integrated system. You're able to focus more on the payload. You're able to focus more on what you want to do. And in our case, what we did at Desert Rats, we had a trailer out there, and we had a NASA Ames rover. And we had Pete Wharton in his office at Ames operating the rover, so we had power and communications. And then that rover could come back, and we later developed an autonomous charging system. That rover could go off and do its thing. It was much faster than the opportunity at 3 millimeters a second. It could go off a kilometer, do its thing, come back, charge up, be under our tent, so it could survive the night, have a nice little heater under that.
When Bigelow goes and builds a hotel, he does not reinvent a communication system, he does not reinvent power, he does not go out and build a Hoover Dam or a nuclear reactor. He buys it commercially. Power and communication should be a commercial thing that you buy, and you have a standardized set of protocols, and it's something you put on the rover, and it's there, and it's done, and you never have to reinvent it again.
We had to solve that for space station and the external utility ports. I was told with a straight face that no, there is no such thing as a standard utility port. There won't be for station. It should be custom designed power supplies for everything that's put on board. I told them that's not how you build a facility, and we were able to make it stick. We've got some options for us going forward here.
Okay, next question, Alex.
I'm back. So I'm a believer in power being. I agree it's the way to go. However, in terms of distribution of energy on the moon, electrical energy, it's actually much more direct. You don't have to worry about wires. You make your wires. In terms of the process of the regolith, where we extract silicon for our silicon solar cells, byproducts turn out to be things like aluminum, calcium, magnesium. All of those good conductors on the moon are perfect because there's no atmosphere to contaminate them. You can make essentially thick film conducting wires on the surface of the moon simply by plating the moon with like aluminum or calcium, and then feed your electricity down there.
In the near term, though, if you're trying to get rovers to go do prospecting inside the dark craters, you can either put a battery on there and try to make them operate for a while, or you could beam them power from one of the crater rims, and you can do that over a distance of 50 miles, and they can continuously operate, not come back and get recharged and recharged and recharged.
I agree, you're right.
Okay, any more questions? I have one last one related to some of the questions that Andy put together for the workshop. So we're trying to gather information to NASA to make informed decisions. So this was a good talk about commercially available power. So I've heard that it's going to be off in the distance. So would it accelerate some of the development, some of the business cases that we're talking about if the companies were to engage in public-private partnerships with NASA?
Every time I talk to an investor or try to get somebody, one of those billionaires that just wants to throw money at something, first words out of their mouth are, is there a customer, and when is the customer going to need it? And it's the same thing that Mike Griffin and I talk about. Until there is a confirmed customer that says we're going to do this, you're not going to get any of these systems built. And that gets to the point where NASA just needs to sit down at some point and say, in 7 years, we're not going to do power on our systems anymore. We're going to buy it as a commercial entity. At that point, you will have providers showing up, knocking on your door. There's 1,000 different ways to do it, and they will be there. But until that time, until they know that there is a customer, they're not going to make the investment.
Yeah, I want to shade a little bit different on that. I think it's above NASA's pay grade in this regard. And I look at what China's doing with their Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese government has decided that they want to own the terrestrial transportation infrastructure across most of this planet. And the Chinese government has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in this, and people use that infrastructure. It is my understanding that they're looking to do something similar to that on the moon. And if you look back in American history, the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 provided a means. We built the first railroad across the American continent, with the United States government putting up the capital and allowing companies to sell bonds against that capital being provided on a milestone basis. And so regardless of what NASA itself has a need for, if the United States government decides, and SPD-1 is actually a very good document for this, but we do not have the advocacy of this at NASA right now. This is more the National Space Council. If you talk to Scott Pace, if you talk to the Vice President and people like that, they want to do stuff like this. There is actually a disconnect at NASA because NASA, and I don't want to say it this way because it might sound pejorative, it's the NSF of space. All of your missions are driven by science. All of the science is driven by the decadals. All the decadals are driven by the science who want to do the science in the next decade. There is no equivalent commercial decadals. So it has to be above NASA's pay grade as a national decision to spend this money, to make this money available, like in the federal financing bank or something like this, to put forth the capital that allow people to build this type of infrastructure, and then NASA as a science agency, the Defense Department as the Defense Department, and whoever in commercial can then use that infrastructure. That's how we built the National Railroad, and nobody in the world figured in 1868 when that railroad was finished that by 1875 the San Joaquin Valley would be the fruit basket of America. And it couldn't be that until that infrastructure was built.
Anybody else wants to add?
Yeah, what you just mentioned is these NASA private partnerships. I mean, you know, CLIPS is out there. I think that's extremely vital. It's extremely vital. It allows these companies to generate completely different revenue because of these partnerships. So they function like a catalytic catalyst, right? So with every government dollar you can make, I don't want to put a number out there, but it is very important. It gives confidence for the investors. So what NASA is doing, also other space agencies, ESA is doing right now, I mean, the concept of the Lunar Village, whatever that is, let's not go into that. So it is very important. And it's also very important to create many companies working on this, so you have this similar redundancy. I mean, who knows which factor is actually going to make one company successful, which another company doesn't, and they can or cannot join forces. So I think it's a key thing, a key question you just asked. The other thing is, I know it's possible from a physics perspective, of course, to supply power from orbit. I wouldn't be the expert. I don't know what the TR levels are. I do understand the communication is much, much better. And we have engineers in our company who are actually working that also with other industry partners, another $1 billion or $1 billion company, Vodafone. So our concept to provide communication between the rovers and the lander, it's pretty much taking off-the-shelf technologies, making them space-worthy. As we all know, if we did have the assets in lunar orbit, that we could all just buy these services, right? That would be very important for all companies. I mean, yes, you can go up there and just, before you descend, deploy your own relay satellite. But do you want to depend on that? No, you don't. You want to have something up and running, which is reliable. So for data, for telemetry, and of course, I mean, we all know how vital it would be to have huge data rates being available through deep space networks, relying on laser communication terminals or things like that. So closing the business case, yes. Having space agencies say, yes, we support this, this is where we're going. It's a huge deal, it's a huge symbolism. I mean, whatever happens there on a detailed technical level is secondary. It's really secondary. And the other thing is there are certain technologies which make a lot of sense to help establish them. So that's the role of the space agencies to help making sure that these technologies get established. All right.
I want to throw a question out to the audience. Who all here has some connection, however tenuous in the past or in the present, to Stanford University? Hold up your hand. In this audience, not many Stanford folks? Okay.
I can't put my hand up here.
Yeah. Well, none of you would have that connection without the Pacific Railway Act of 1862.
One of the things that I actually do, I'm a jack of all trades, master of none. One of the things I actually do is I'm a translator. I'm enough of an engineer that I can talk engineer to the engineers. I'm enough of a manager that I can talk management to management. They don't know that I'm not good at either one of them, so I kind of fool my way around. Let me translate public-private partnerships for just a minute to a lot of the NASA guys here. Okay, the NASA guys see the private guys bringing in 85% of the money, NASA providing 15% of it, and then using the resources. And that's not bad, that's a good idea. The public guys, the commercial guys, see the government providing 85% of the money, and then providing 15% of it, and then using it commercially. So every time you use that PP word, you need to know which guy you're talking to, because I guarantee you there is a complete mismatch of thoughts on that. And I know, because I'm working with a guy right now, and he's a commercial guy, he's never done anything government, never done anything space, and the guy is insistent that the government's going to give him 85% of the money to do this. And I just keep telling him.
Yeah, I mean, both sides have to look at a PPP as a business deal. It's got to be good for the government, it's got to be good for the private guy. It's not, it can't be one way or the other. I was part of companies that participated in the EELD program back in the late 90s. Ended up being a great deal for the government, a terrible deal for the companies. Lost their money. So we have to learn those lessons. But to go back to Dennis's point, I think the SPD-1 has some great words in there, one of which is we're going back to the moon in part, and I'm paraphrasing, for economic development. And we need to start recognizing that economic development is one of the purposes for going into space. It's not in NASA's mission statement right now. It's science and exploration and other things like that. Economic development now has made it into the nation's policy at the highest level. SPD2 assigns the role of the Commerce Department to do something. I mean, it's a little vague, but it's kind of nice that they're getting the Commerce Department involved. And I think those are all great advances, what we need to figure out from a NASA perspective is what's NASA's role in all of that.
Oh, are we running out of time?
I think that's.
Oh, go ahead. Last comment. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, just one last comment. If you look at historically what governments do, governments provide infrastructure so that commercial entities can go ahead and operate and do things. And NASA doesn't think in those terms. NASA, from a commercial side, what I'd really like to see, like to see NASA build a port where we can come and land and then drive off and go do things. And NASA provides medical resources and other, it provides all the things you have in any kind of port. I'm a Navy guy, okay? Governments run ports. Governments make roads. That's what they do. And I think that's, SPD2, is along those lines of the government's role should now be re-evaluated and move forward into the future to provide a commercial basis to be able to do things on the moon.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's thank the panel members for their participation.
Thank you to Allison and the panel. We'd like to bring up Matt Henderson and Ilaria Janelli. And they're going to be talking about the International Space University summer project that they've just completed on the lunar night survival. And I know from my own experience, those kind of projects are quite fascinating because it's a multicultural, multidiscipline kind of team that gets together to do this kind of work. So we're very interested in hearing them talk about that. Can bring us.
Hello everyone, my name is Ilaria. I am a new alumni of ISU, and here we have four, actually we have four in total. There is Matt here, Bonnie and JD are sitting down there, they are new alumni, and they took part to this project. So we thanks ISU for being here, so thanks to the International Space University. The Lunar Night Survivor project was part of this space study program that was this year was in the Netherlands, and it was a co-sponsored project by ESA and NASA. So we thanks our sponsor, and we thanks our chairs, Rob Espostima from ESA, and Matthew Sogenfrey from NASA, and as well Antonio Martello from DLR. So the project that you're going to see, it's really addressed, but probably we are going to bring on the table something that you can use. There are lots of different points that we have been discussing, and we actually have addressed, and we think it's a good point for discussion. So in here we propose the mission statement is create a scalable power generation and distribution system for utilization during lunar days and nights to enable a sustained presence on the moon. The particular scope of this project was to propose a scalable solution for supply and distributing power looking at during lunar nights, which is we consider kind of the worst case scenario, the most challenging scenarios here. In this project, there are a few assumptions. So we have created a vision here, which is not only that we are going to provide an engineering solution for the project, but we actually bring context, a very realistic context. So in here, we are looking at a power solution that can actually be immediately implemented on the moon, and that can be used for future long-term application as well. A power that can support science, that can support commercial activity, and eventually other missions beyond the moon. In this context, we started with a few astronauts from 2 to 6 during the phase that we consider, and then you see better. But we have also included like a much larger population on the moon. So the power solution and generation distribution that you will see, it's illegal by design, which means that this is based by a legal design thinking approach on which we have account of the legal context, so the current legal context and commercial context, to make it legal, from the start. we have found a point of discussion which is a kind of like similar to what we have been discussing before. The use of the power on the moon, it can be seen in a much larger view. We need to implement the power solution accounting of the ISPO, which is the short for International Space Power Organization, which is an organization that manages and distribute the distribution of power in the outer space, where the stakeholders can be both governments, institutions, companies, where all the parties that are taking part in this game have legal implication to that. We can, you can ask us all the details later. We just want to go to the power to get to the point. So there are many challenges of the lunar environments that we have to face, and we must bring a power of a reasonable amount of kilowatt to allow lunar timeline focus or the phases approach, just to make a context. So to our knowledge, when we were reading and brainstorming about the problem of the lunar nights, there are many works that are focused on the villages, on cities, on like larger distribution of power. But there is a gap, because now there is like only a few things on the moon, but there is no villages. So we have to fill this gap in some way. So we thought to have a first phase, phase one. This phase is built in agreement to what you find in the Global Exploration Roadmap and the current commercial activity, where governments and commercial partners can send rovers, can send cargoes on the moon, but you won't find is operational, but they are not on the lunar surface. So during phase two starts with the first landing of humans, so 2 astronauts landing on the lunar surface, and is divided in 3 different parts. And the reason is because we start with 2 astronauts. They are living in habitable rovers, and then we are going to have more 4 astronauts and then 6 astronauts throughout the phase. During phase 2B, the first habitat will be deployed on the lunar surface. During phase 2C, the habitat will be initiated, and there is a switch between the phase 2C and phase 3, where the astronaut will be living in the habitat. So the habitat can gas 6 and more astronauts on the moon. And by having this vision, we have quantified the corresponding amount of power that we need throughout all of these phases. So those phases has been designed by fact rather than years, because we know that years and time can be a compromise fact. So we first, there are two points here to keep in mind. Landing on the humans on the moon is the start of the phase 2. The end of the phase 2 is the habitat. And the habitat and the use of the power. So from phase 2C to phase 3, we go from kilowatt to megawatt. So there is a much larger consumption of power to have about 50 humans on the lunar surface. So if you want to bring humans on the moon, we have to account of the human physiological requirements. And we have to make clear about this stuff, because we have to quantify what humans need to survive on the moon. So in here you find a lot of different biases that correspond to the human physiological requirements, and they correspond in quantity in terms of percentages and in terms of kilowatts. And we have estimated that for about 2 astronauts on the moon, we need only for them to survive 6.5 kilowatts. So in here, all of these data are based on the current on the ISS and related projects. We have assumed that our astronauts will be living in habitable rovers. So because the ISS has a much larger meter cube compared to a habitable rover, those data might look like an overestimation of what is going to be the actual power consumption on the lunar surface. However, you have to consider about the issue of contamination. So having humans on the lunar surface is implied to consider any healthcare system or any life support system of a grade of redundancies about 2, 3, maximum 4, which is mean having a much larger power consumption and having a much higher, greater payload. So now, here you see a lot of different numbers that correspond to the phases. So in phase 1, you had 2.3 kilowatts, and we do not have humans. So during phase 2, the first human landing, and during phase 3, you have up to 6 astronauts. So we had to think about a power solution that can actually match those power requirements. So it is important to actually figure out the needs, the power needs that we are going to need on the moon. So here I'm going to leave the stage to Matt Anderson.
Okay, so from here we've got our power inputs now, we've got our phases. We know how many astronauts are going to be coming to the moon and approximately what they're going to be needing for life support. And over the course of the summer, we had a number of really good talks from ESA, NASA, and a number of other people, and about various power options, how to support the power requirements that we need here. And what we eventually came up with is what we've got here. We call it the power cell. The focus here, some of the key features of the power cell here is, first of all, it's a scalable solution. Beginning at 10 kilowatts at least per cell. The more you deploy, you can easily get up to hundreds of kilowatts. There's a fair amount of redundancy in here, so each subunit that you see there can supply power or energy if one of the other subsystems fails. The idea is that we're going to be deploying multiple power cells, so there's going to be inter-cell redundancy as well. There's a substantial amount of flexibility here, so these subunits can be taken out and put on rovers if you need to, bring your batteries to a remote location. And the idea is that it's going to be fairly quick to deploy this. So it's exactly what you see here. It looks like a lander. It's intended to be a lander. The idea is you land it in place, you connect it, you let it extend. There's going to be a controlled descent. You let it extend and open up, connect it to an existing grid if there's previous cells and habitats already there. And then within a few hours, it should be fully operational. And the last thing I want to say is that the subunits themselves are intended to be approximately the same size, and this is intended to standardize construction before we deploy the whole system. Digging into it with a little more detail here. At the top, we've got photovoltaics. About 20 meters squared of area here will give us about 8 kilowatts of power. We've got fuel cells and lithium-ion batteries, and I just want to make a point here that these sum to about 2,500 kilowatt hours of stored energy. That amount of energy is what we calculated would be required if our kilopower reactor at the bottom there were to fail completely in the middle of a 14-day lunar night. And I shouldn't say in the middle of a 14-day lunar night, I should say at the start of a 14-day lunar night. You've got 2 astronauts on the moon that need power, and 2,500 kilowatt hours is expected to get them through that emergency situation in time to get them rescued. But anyway, at the bottom you've got the kilopower reactor that'll, is operational, will provide continuous power through the lunar night. And of course, during the lunar night, our crew members are going to be, in safe mode. They're not going to be doing EVAs or anything too rigorous like that. These are the primary systems of our power cell. We've also got a control unit at the top here. This is going to handle communications with Earth, systems monitoring, navigation during descent and whatnot. There's also got to be a thermal radiator system. We've got 8 to 10 meters squared here. After talking with Lee Mason over breakfast this morning, we understand that should probably be maybe up around near 20 meters squared. But we've got to dissipate about 30 kilowatts of energy there, which obviously accounts for, or amounts to about 25% efficiency for a kilopower reactor. And we've got a rocket-powered landing system. Without going into detail on that, we're really focused on the power elements of this, of our power cell here. The condensed dimensions of our power cell are about 2.5 meters in diameter, 4 meters in height, which gives us an approximate volume of 20 cubic meters. And accounting for the masses of all the subunits, we figure we're going to be coming in at about 4,500 kilograms. This system should be launchable by all these launch vehicles that you see here. We're going across the globe all the way to China and going in between public space agencies as well as private space agencies. So we think it should be a fairly robust system that a number of agencies would be interested in deploying for us. Over time, and as we move through phase 1 through to A, B, C, and into long-term phase 3, we figure that you don't actually need a single type of power cell. You probably want a family of power cells that will help you meet your power needs. The one I've shown you is the alpha power cell with a kilopower reactor, Stirling engine converter with batteries and fuel cells for storage and photovoltaics. You see you got about 18 kilowatts of power there and 2,500 kilowatt hours of energy storage. If you simplify things, you can go to the beta power cell where you've got a little bit more batteries, a little more battery power to supply your your active missions, your EVAs and whatnot. Alternatively, you can switch to the gamma power cell, and you'll have a flywheel energy storage vehicle that gives you up to 3,400 kilowatt hours of storage. And we think that the combination of all three of these is really ultimately going to be the most realistic combination of deploying power. So how much power do we need and when? So Ilaria told us that we need 26 kilowatts of power at the start of phase 2. That's meant to support 2 crew members. You're going to deploy your first power cell in phase 1 before you even have anybody there. Then you're going to start bringing some more power cells out. We figure by the end of 2A, you're going to need 44 kilowatt hours. But by the end of phase 2C, after you've sent a bunch out and you've got a fairly robust team of crew members out there, you're going to have up to 124 kilowatts of power with the respective amount of energy storage going along with that. How might that look in terms of setting up a microgrid? So in phase 1, we're doing things like remote sensing. We're figuring out where we're going to land, a lot of robotic missions and whatnot, and we're going to send our first power cell out there. It's going to provide primary power to a bunch of initial scientific work. There's going to be some habitable rovers that will be deployed before our crew members arrive, and this marks the end of phase 1 and really where we're going to enter the meat of what our project was intending to address. We're going to send out some redundant power. We don't want to leave our astronauts hanging too much, and then we send our first crew members out. As activities build, we support, we send power out first, then we send more astronauts and more science activities. As we build it, we send out more rovers to support future crew members with astronauts. And as time goes on and we accelerate, we're going to send out a number of more power cells. These are going to be the gamma and the beta power cells to support what will eventually be a much larger permanent habitat. A lot more potential for crew members and multiple redundancies here going into this habitat to make sure that if a system goes down, if a power cell falls over or fails to properly deploy, our crew members are not left stranded on the moon. This is an artist rendition. We had some very good artists helping us out throughout the whole thing. They were members of the team. We've got wireless power transceivers and receivers here for wireless transfer. We've talked about that a fair bit today. Varying in distances from hundreds of meters to kilometers to hundreds of kilometers. We've got a satellite transceiver in the top right there, beaming power down to power cells and habitats on the lunar surface. All well within the scope of discussion today. To sum things up, our power proposal for surviving the lunar night is the power cell. It's a modular and easily scalable system. It provides multiple redundancies both within the power cell itself as well as between multiple power cells and multiple habitat units. Power and energy are scaled to meet the expected requirements of 6 crew members. The more people you send out, the more power you need, and you're going to send the power out first. The power cell architecture meets the needs of phase 1 and 2, which is really where we wanted to focus because we really wanted to address how do we get from November 2018 to 6 people on the moon. It's going to require about 124 kilowatts of power, and we think we can do it with an architecture similar to what we've proposed here. And a distributed power grid is envisioned for early stages before the larger habitat is achieved. This is the team, happy group of people, very motivated and innovative. It was great to work with all of them. We've got Matt Sorgenfry, Rob Posima, and Antonio Martello in there. I don't have a pointer with me, otherwise I'd point them out. Lots of big thanks to those guys for supporting us and guiding us. They provided a lot of feedback. We've also got a website if you feel like checking us out, lunarnightsurvival.com. And at that, we will answer any questions. Okay, go ahead.
Alex, Mass of Lunar Resources. I missed, what's the total mass of one of your units?
The alpha cell was 4,500 kilograms. That was the main one that I presented.
The total stack?
Yeah, the total stack of the first generation that I presented was about 4,500 kilograms.
Okay. Fine.
Ian Jakutka, NASA Glenn Research Center. You talked about an integrated network, your grid structure. What is your bus voltage, and is it AC or DC?
Off the top of my head, I can't answer that exactly. It was addressed, though, by a number of team members in the report. I encourage you to go to the website, and the report it'll link you to the report there. There is a good discussion of that at the end of chapter 3.
Okay, well, thanks again to
No. Okay, so we do have a few more minutes for group discussion. I think we're supposed to wrap up at 5:30. So first what I want to do is I want to say thank you to iSpace and to Honeybee Robotics, who provided the refreshments for us today. So thank you. So basically what's going to happen next is Andy and I, with the help of our note takers and anyone else who would like to contribute, have two tasks ahead of us. First, we will be providing an outbrief on today's sessions to the league meeting tomorrow. So all of you are going to get to hear a 15-minute recap of what you just spent today sitting through, as well as the new folks who weren't here today, and there are quite a few. And then also we will be compiling a report which will go to headquarters. I don't know what the timeline is on when that report is expected, but I'm guessing probably the sooner the better.
Yeah, certainly the sooner, the more chance it has of influencing investment decisions that get made in the next few months.
So really quickly, I just want to give some summary that I've just come up with in the past few minutes of what I heard so far about what we talked about at the workshop. So first of all, we had our summary discussion questions, and I again urge everyone to fill out the questionnaire either on the paper form or online. But the first 3 questions on there are asking about the compelling science, exploration, and commercial mission capabilities that are enabled at different sort of tiers of night survival. And of course, if you ask a room full of scientists what instrument they want, you're basically going to get everybody's personal favorite. And so I think really to address that type of question, I'm going to refer everyone to the products that were produced by the ASM SAT and the Next SAT. All of those types of questions are answered in there. For each of the key science questions that are identified, the final report actually determines measurements, mission goals, and payloads for 5 different types of tiered missions. And the tiers are basically orbiters, small payloads to the surface that don't survive the night, larger payloads and rovers to the surface that do survive the night, and then we also called out sample return as a separate tier of missions because that requires not only getting down but getting back up. as well as technology development recommendations for each of those 5 major missions. And then I just wanted to note, and we did talk about this morning, that for each of these key science investigations, we can make progress at each tier. So really, we just want to get to the surface. And then, of course, once we're there, we want to live as long as we can. So sort of the 3 overall themes that I heard during discussions were standardization of systems and or modular systems, and that kind of seemed to cross everything from science to exploration to technology. Whether it's interfaces, platforms, power and communication, component databases, and even possibly payload packages, including those that are landing site agnostic. And of course, we heard a variety of different payload packages. I'm not going to list those out here. But when, sort of transitioning into an overarching theme for payloads, another thing that came up again and again was networked science. Whether that's a lunar geophysical network, whether that's a network that includes exosphere or volatile transport science, I think there's a lot that can be enabled with the network of instruments on the moon. And I think I'm hoping maybe right now, in the remaining 30 or 40 minutes that we have, we can talk a little bit about International Lunar Network. A lot of the people that were on the organizing committee for that program are here in this room, and I would love to know what to do to kick that off again, or if we want to kick that off again. So I'd like to hear from just the general audience on that. And then finally, another theme is how will different space agencies implement the Lunar Exploration Roadmap? Whether it's looking at prioritized science and exploration goals, tapping into outside communities, what is the role for commercial, and of course the theme of science enabling exploration and exploration enabling science. So
another thing is distributed systems versus building up a centralized system that might run off of a single power source in one locality. And it seems that a lot of the science and resource-related activities would drive us more toward distributed and more mobile systems. So I think, again, that's kind of 2 aspects that could drive what types of solutions you come up with. And another one is just, do you take the approach of just providing a lot of power? That was brought up a number of times, versus more elegant thermal and energy management solutions. Will just providing a lot of power basically solve all of these problems, and should we go that way? Or do we need to be, take a look at other approaches? One thing there did seem to be agreement, it would be good to go do a lot of qualification of components for the kind of thermal conditions that we will expect on the moon, because that may not have been done for those kind of ranges in the past, and that might at least provide us with a lot of things we can use. So those were sort of where I found sort of the big questions that evolved from the discussions. And we don't expect to get the answer today, but certainly we have a lot to work with here. So should we open it up to comments from folks either related to some of the questions I brought up or the items that Renee was talking about?
I'm going to sit down so I can type.
So if you've got a lunar network that's looking at both sort of space physics and geophysics types of stuff, those things don't shut off when the sun goes down. I don't understand why you would consider not powering the stations through the lunar night. But the events happen all the time, and if you shut down, you're missing half your data set. And what we desperately need is a more complete data set on these things. So I'm not sure I understand. I can understand sort of the engineering point of view, but I can't understand the scientific point of view that would say, well, we can shut it down at night and ignore that.
Yeah, I think there were some applications where that was feasible, others certainly not.
I think Dr. Clark was up before me.
I would say that in terms of should we just go for as much power as possible, that You know, it really depends on what kind of thing you want to do. If you're looking at taking advantage of opportunities on commercial landers and rovers for low-cost compact packages, you obviously want a solution that's going to emphasize making something small work very well. And that may be different. That's why I talked earlier about 3 or 4 different regimes in terms of the problem we're going to solve, hopefully with some generic solutions. It really depends on what your area of interest is. And I think that we need pieces of all of them. I'm not suggesting that we just need small packages or just human stations. So, anybody can comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think we need to, what's the point of going back to the moon? That's something the League asked back when we were asked to develop a lunar exploration roadmap. Why are we going back to the moon? That will then dictate what we do. Huh?
I started asking a rhetorical question.
Well, I mean, why are we going back? I mean, that dictates what we propose. I mean, yes, we have small packages, we have large packages, we've talked about gridded networks, it's all going to cost money. We've talked about commercial participation, but the important thing is that in order to enable the big picture and the small picture, for many cases, we need to survive the lunar night. We need to be able to operate during the lunar night. That's important for a geophysical network. It's important for an exospheric network around the moon. It's important for being able to go into permanently shadowed regions and prospect for these volatiles, and it's important to prospect outside those regions as well during the lunar night to maximize the return. So there are, I can think of instances where you could hibernate. You have a long-lived rover that's just exploring the moon. During the night time, it just hunkers down and then starts up again the next day, but it's long-lived. It can survive the night, it doesn't have to operate during the night. But coming back to Renee's question about lunar geophysical network, if we have long-lived 10-year lifetime power sources on 3 or 4 nodes, some on the far side, some on the near side, you have a lot of time then for shorter-lived stations to be added, so that different communities can contribute to the bigger picture. You can add more nodes to the network as it goes on. So yeah, it's going to be ILN and another name, but it is open, or should be open, to participation from the rest of the world, and there will be standards. So that will be defined by the anchor nodes, so to speak, or by the ILN special report. So there's an opportunity for long-term science to actually be global in nature over a decadal period. So and I think we have an opportunity there. But I mean, think about, why are we going back to the moon? We're going to create wealth.
problems for every aspect, but you do want to make progress in each step and build a structure that allows different aspects to be achieved. The second thing, which I was a little disappointed in today's discussion, is that there was very little mention about the importance of infrastructure. We mentioned the trains opening up the west, nobody mentioned the interstate highways, but we have zero infrastructure right now. And infrastructure is absolutely key if we're going to make some of these components together. If you put a small satellite for the lander, you don't want to have to do everything in order to achieve that. We really need to find a way of putting together and building infrastructure piece by piece so that all these wonderful ideas that have come up today can be achieved. And we didn't talk about that much, but to me it seems like a key component to make things happen.
Follow on to that comment. Infrastructure is critical and important. I've seen it in my career where the infrastructure wasn't there in terms of space, and therefore commercial things couldn't be done because it wasn't there. And NASA, I think, is reticent now to build infrastructure.
Have, you know, the discussion about survive the lunar night and operate during a lunar night. And to a certain extent, you know, one can think of it as a switch, but there is actually in between a median that needs to be considered. because the massive hardware associated with generating electricity is typically much less than the massive hardware associated with storing that energy for the subsequent time associated. So for example, during Constellation, we had power modules for a polar region that would create 10 kilowatts of power continuously, but then only 2 kilowatts of power during eclipse period. So one of the things the community needs to think about is not just the, do I survive, do I operate, but is there an intermediate between those? Because if you say, I want to operate during the lunar night or an eclipse period, that has a certain infrastructure associated with that. And so is there a nominal lower operating mode besides survival? So that needs to come into the conversation as well at some point.
So just thinking still about the infrastructure question. I wasn't sure whether to bring this up or not, but maybe it's worth reflecting on. So the Chinese have publicly talked about their vision for the next decade, and towards the middle to the end of the next decade, they've said that they would like to build an international lunar research station. Now, I don't know the details of what that would be, but I understand it to be a bit like the Belt and Road Initiative, where they build infrastructure for providing things like power, and they would invite the nations of the world to come and use their infrastructure. Is that an opportunity? Is that a threat? How do you, is that something you want to respond to? Let's leave it out there.
Hello. Hello. Hi, Ryan Colbert from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. I just want to add a comment to the fact of lunar dust. My background's in dust abrasion, and now in spaceflight operations, and anything that's going to be operating through the night is operating over what would be considered long duration. And you can ask Roving Ron especially about this, but anything that's moving on the moon is going to have to deal with dust, and we can assume that for the most part, for operations, that things are going to be dirty. And I don't think that can be underestimated. I think regardless if there is a terminator effect and dust is lofted from that electrostatics, that's great, but I think anything that is actually moving anyway, it's going to be an order of magnitude dirtier. So I like to say that things are going to get dirty as Schmidt out there. So.
I want to say something. So I represent United.
Yeah, we should be identifying
I
ourselves.
represent United Nations Center for Space Science and Space Technology in Asia Pacific. So I want to give maybe a little bit global perspective, because I'm pretty sure I'm more aware of what's happening in the world space community than most of the people here. You guys are all experts in what NASA is doing, what ESA is doing, but it's not just about NASA and ESA. There's a lot of work being done by the Indian Space Research Organization. There's a lot of work that's being done by the Chinese. There's even a lot of work being done by the Africans. And I'm aware of some of that work. And I speak as a scientist, some of that work is far more complicated than things I've seen here. So there are, like, for example, our colleagues from the International Space Station talked about a Stirling cycle reactor. There are plans to put a megawatt power reactor on the moon by some of these nations. So I do believe that these type of problems that were discussed today could easily be overcome by international cooperation, because a lot of the other nations on Earth also have resources. Yes, NASA has done a lot of good work in the 60s and 70s, but that was 60s and 70s, it's long gone. Today, I don't want to be critical of what NASA does, but they're not doing that well, because of budget constraints, of course, because of government constraints, because of policies. So it's not their fault, because there are a lot of good scientists here I've seen who are very, very good at what they do. But some of these nations are spending far more resources than what NASA is spending for going to the moon or for going to Mars. So I do believe that, and I don't know which platform can be used for this, maybe United Nations or maybe a similar platform, but if an area of global goodwill and cooperation can be created, I'm pretty sure many of the scientists here can actually have more of an outlet, more of resources to get things done, because at the end of the day, it all comes down to money, infrastructure, the power to launch things. For example, today I was having a discussion with somebody. Israel can launch payload much more cheaper than any of the commercial companies that's represented here. They can launch between $17,000 and for everybody. So I do believe that the solution to many of the problems discussed here relies on international collaboration. Otherwise, what will happen? There will be a lot of discussions. Years will pass. 2022 will come. 2026 will come. We have this dream. We have that dream. We have this objective. We have that objective. But then most of these objectives probably won't be met, because if you look at past reports 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a lot of different things was envisioned for 2018, but that hasn't happened, either due to budget or policy constraints or government constraints. So I do believe that more of a global collective effort needs to be done. If it can be done in some way, I'm pretty sure many of these objectives can be reached. Of course, there are challenges like Chinese, like the ESA colleague mentioned about the Chinese, but they are far more advanced than what he has mentioned, but they won't easily share this knowledge because they also have their own political constraints. But I'm pretty sure if some sort of a global platform can be created, maybe through platforms like these, I'm pretty sure that maybe some of these problems can be overcome, and hopefully maybe in 5 years, 10 years, instead of discussing how to go back to the moon, how to survive the lunar night, etc., we might be talking about, okay, we are on the moon, we are already doing this, what is more than this, what is the next step? So that's just my little 2 cents I want to put into it from a global perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Chris Pestak with USRA. Just a comment with regards to infrastructure. I think you have to be careful how you define infrastructure, and what, as Clive said, what are your real objectives? I think when you talk about the exploration and the potential exploitation of the moon and putting in infrastructure, I'll go back and liken it to a historical example. We've heard a lot about the railroads and stuff like that. Think of the Klondike Gold Rush. I think it occurred in 1896. I think it was about that year. No business person in his or her right mind would have spent all their resources to build a supply station in the middle of the Yukon in 1890. Because at the time it appeared there was nothing, there was no reason to go there. It was a barren, barren wilderness. Then when the resources were discovered there and there was a reason to go to that barren wilderness, then there wasn't, you didn't even need the government to provide an infrastructure. There was such a rush to go there that people wanted to try and exploit those resources. So when you talk about an infrastructure, you want to make sure you don't build a bridge to nowhere. You want to do the prospecting first so that you understand what's there, in what concentrations, and is it usable. And then when you do enough prospecting to find where the resources are and if they're usable, then I think all this stuff we're talking about will take care of itself very quickly. But until you know what you're going for, then it's hard to talk about having in situ factories that are doing this or that. You got to know where to put them. You got to know what to extract. And so when you talk about infrastructure, I would say then focus your infrastructure capabilities on prospecting, because you have to prospect first to know why you're going there in the end. And if, as the administrator said, there's potentially tens of trillions of dollars worth of mineral resources on the moon to be exploited, there will be such a rush of industry that'll create so much commerce, we won't know what to do with it. So just to be careful when you talk about infrastructure that it's defined the right way.
Yeah, I think you're saying it's a question of scale and application, what the infrastructure is for. Yeah. Because I think what we've found is even to do the prospecting, there may be the need for some level of infrastructure.
Yeah. Rachel.
Hi, David Page from UCLA. I agree with Carly, this has been a very interesting meeting. The technical challenge of surviving the lunar night is basically one of managing power and managing temperature or heat. And right now, I think we're not quite there in terms of technology for surviving the lunar night from the standpoint of either small or large vehicles. But one kind of technology that could really help us here is the concept of a solid-state battery. So right now the problem is when you get cold, the liquids in the battery freeze, and then when you bring them back up, the battery doesn't work anymore. And so as a consequence, you need to keep the whole battery warm during the polar night, which is during the lunar night, which is very difficult. With solid-state battery technology, it'll be possible to not have to worry so much about the thermal state of the battery. That'll work better at cold temperatures. And with that, then you would be able to actually minimize the amount of mass that you need to stay warm, just the electronics or whatever, experiments or other sort of habitats you keep going. And so if we could, make a breakthrough in that area, maybe NASA could help in this area, it would enable a lot of space exploration, including on Mars as well as on the Moon. Oh, and on Earth as well, because we'd have much better electrical vehicles.
There we go. Just to go back to what Renee was talking about in terms of the geophysical network, I was wondering, just to throw out, does that provide a framework for looking at infrastructure, standardization, those types of things that could be a model for not only that, but other things as well? And that wasn't an intentional straight line, but go ahead, please.
I would say so. You're talking about global communications. If you want to use the far side, and we certainly want to put nodes of that network, that long-lived network, on the lunar far side. There is a ComSat at L2 that is available. We can't use it. It's Chinese. So international cooperation is possible, but not probable. So it's something to consider, that infrastructure would require global communications, especially far-side communications, to enable a geophysical network. As I said, if these are long-lived nodes, then other nations, other agencies, other entities can then add to it over time, and we become a much bigger network that then produces a much better science and exploration return. And so long-lived becomes important. Surviving multiple lunar nights becomes important. Having global communications and international cooperation then maximizes the return.
Hi there. Bonnie Posselt, medical doctor from the International Space University and the Royal Air Force. The one thing that we haven't necessarily addressed today is our appetite for risk. We've talked about lots of different things, but in order to progress and actually go forward on many of the things we've spoken about today, we need to establish what the ground rules are and what each of our appetites for risk are. And it may be that government agencies have a very different expectation of risk and failure, not just for science, but also for human survivability, than commercial companies. And I think it's important to talk about that appetite for risk and be upfront about that, so you understand what the expectations are, kind of reducing that friction between the private companies and government organisations.
That comment brings to mind a little story. So many years ago, there was this faster, better, cheaper, and a fellow named Dan Golden was pushing this right and left. And his answer was, do it faster, do it better, do it cheaper, take a risk, but don't fail.
Yeah, risk was something I was thinking about earlier in some of the discussions. But I'm not sure we're in the same position we were in 1969. And when you talk about the risk, I think in some ways governments are less risk tolerant than private companies are.
They're not risk tolerant at all.
Yeah, yeah. But not sure how that plays out in this scenario, but it's something we need to think about.
There is, Sean from Aston again, there is at least discussed a dramatic shift in the risk profile from NASA, from the administration to the administrator and all the way through. It's important that this community be part of it, because the CLIPS program, which is our first shot at getting back to the moon, has been described as taking shots on goal. Now, that's phenomenal because that means there is an acceptance of risk. But here's the thing, that's not just the transportation providers, that's the scientists too. And so we are going to be taking, if the CLIPS program lives up to as it has been described, we're going to be taking shots on goal. We're going to accept, and the administrator, have heard him say this, there is a possible outcome of this program, which is new craters on the moon. And your science payload may be part of that. So, at least it's on the moon, thank you. But I think this would be a great topic for another panel either tomorrow or the day after. But yes, risk is definitely a piece of the discussion. It's still making this shift, it's still making its way through the entire community. It's not, even though it's being used as language, let's see how it manifests.
So it's always good to ask a question that needs an answer at 5:50. So talking of infrastructure, listening to what I've heard, you take the example of communication infrastructure. I hear the scientists saying they would like the government to put a comm relay into lunar orbit so that we can do good science quickly. But I hear the commercial side saying, no, don't do that. Promise that you'll use one if someone else puts it in. And that would help the commercials put in communication infrastructure. So I am curious to know whether that's what other people heard. I heard the same thing about power.
I was going to say, I definitely heard the same.
Power's a bit more woolly because you've got to have something on the surface, and where on the surface, how are you going to distribute the power? To me, the comm relay would be the first achievable goal, as in it's something you could easily see multiple customers doing, but who should be putting it in? The agencies, or the agencies just agreeing to be a customer?
Yeah, I definitely heard the same thing. And certainly in terms of power, one person said that the government should provide the power, and someone else said the government should be buying power. So that's probably a question back to the audience.
So a commercial answer, okay? And that is how good is the government's word, quote unquote. If the government can give you an invoice, all right, for 400 kilowatts of power on the moon that you can take to the bank as a company and say, I've got this here, now lend me the money to be able to do that, that's fine. The government won't do that. In fact, they'll give you a piece of paper and then come back a year later and say, oh, we didn't mean that, we're sorry for canceling that program. And industry won't function that way. It simply won't function that way. And the industries that I've been involved with will not function that way. They want to have a guarantee that there is in fact going to be a market, and that market is going to make that commitment from the government as a government, and that's part of it.
Yeah, that's the real risk in all of this.
That's a significant risk.
I can introduce myself, Clive Neal.
Who is that guy?
Yeah, that guy. All right, so why are we going back to the moon? Come back to that again. If you want the governments to be able to give you that invoice and take that extra risk, why are we going back to the moon? And I would argue it's permanence. If you have permanence, then you need infrastructure. If you've got a long-term commitment from multiple governments, multiple agencies that we're going to the moon and we're going to have permanence, you've then got a basis to build up that infrastructure, and Dennis can sell you the power that he has and so on and so forth.
You have the power.
You have the power. Well, you might have, I got nothing. But why are we going back? If we're going to go back as a, and I hate this term, stepping stone, there's no permanence. If you've got permanence, you've got the enabler for this space economy to take off. For private industry to actually build viable public-private partnerships, to make those work, to grow the economy, because we've got permanence. We've got a commitment to permanence in order to go elsewhere. Then you expand out. Moon's the closest. It's a logical first step. But you don't abandon assets, you have permanence there. And then you leverage that as you go out further to Mars, and you continue to grow in incremental steps. You've got to have permanence in order to make this work. Piecemeal, here's a crumb, there's a crumb. We're going to do a CLIPS program. Oh, craters on the moon, not doing that anymore. Got to have permanence. That's why we're going back to the moon, in my mind, is permanence. That enables so much more than this piecemeal thing that can flip-flop again in the next administration. If you show an administration changes that you have started to grow a new economy by private companies making lots of hires, a lot of enthusiasm, and you show that to Congress, they're going to take notice of that because we're building a sector of the economy that is new. That's going to carry some weight, in my opinion, but we've got to have permanence. No permanence, yeah, why are we here?
Yeah, Clive's right. To answer your question about a communications relay on the moon, if you're going to pay somebody to build a communication satellite and get 10% usage out of it, you're going to have to pay a heck of a lot more for that satellite. And by the way, Bezos and Elon and all those guys are building 17,000 satellites to put into orbit so that they can get 100% use by 6 or 7 billion people. So it's a question of where can I invest my money? And Clive's right. If there's a permanent solution, a permanent infrastructure, a permanent commitment to the moon, then the commercial guys will go up there. If there's not, it's simply a question of should I invest my money here or should I invest it there? And if I'm going to build 2 satellites and it's going to get, you know, very little usage, I'm not going to make my money back as compared to some other investment. Very simple.
Don't hear that very often. Bob's right.
All right, then I'm going to throw mine in here. That's not necessarily the case. Elon Musk started SpaceX because the Russians didn't want to give him a cheap launch to put a greenhouse on the moon. When he went over there, that was his goal when he cashed out of PayPal, to take the majority of his money and put a greenhouse on the moon, on Mars, so that it would inspire people. He goes over to Russia. Russia wasn't going to give him a cheap launch. He said, okay, like Cartman, screw you, I'm going home and going to build a launch vehicle company, which he has done. And he has provided tremendous value to the taxpayer because he has vision. He wants to do this. He wants to go to Mars. Elon wants to die on Mars. Jeff Bezos, who was a former student for the Exploration and Development of Space chapter president, said he started Amazon so he could make enough money to help open the solar system to billions of people. And if you look again back in our history, you had people like Bill Boeing, you had Jack Northrop, you had Howard Hughes, you had a former railroad lawyer turned president who helped get the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 passed. I guess my point here is let's cultivate and let's work together as a community, because some of these people are going to do it. Jeff is going to spend $1 billion a year going to the moon. They just published in the past couple of weeks their design spec for their lunar lander that they're going to provide payloads for. How do we, and again, I'll state it again, it's kind of above NASA's pay grade. But NASA has been given a direction under SPD1, or the nation has, to go back to the moon in a sustainable manner. It has been the unfortunate truth at NASA, both in the vision for space exploration and today in this new effort, that gets interpreted as it flows downhill. And it has been interpreted in ways to not support the larger thing, but that's the reason we have a National Space Council. That's why Scott Pace is there. That's why some of these people are there. How do you, as NASA, at NASA headquarters, how do you take advantage of what the President has said, and in the next president's going to say something else, but if you look at the trend, it has been more in this direction. So this is why I talk about standards. Standards helps lower the cost of doing business. The government is really good at doing standards. And there are some things that governments do well. There's some things that NASA does extremely well. How can we help leverage and support these private individuals who build big corporations, who want to spend money, and the rest of us who want to do it, go to the moon and then home to Mars? That would be my point here, and this goes to what Clive is saying, that goes to permanence. Our government has said, John, in 2006, the head of OSTP, the economic development of the solar system has been settled by Congress. Well, it didn't really happen that way. That was a faith statement by him, but SPD1 has stated it again. Let's continue to build on that. Let's bring the politicals and NASA and the community together, because when we do that, just like that former railroad lawyer in the middle of a war for the life of our country has to build and spend a lot of money to build a railroad across the country because it was good for the future of the nation. Why are we going back to the moon? Because it's good for the future of our nation as well as the rest of mankind.
Jay here from ISU. Just given the discussion here about infrastructure and public-private partnerships and stuff, something that we came up with at ISU, and I think Yolari mentioned this really quickly, that is really relevant here, it would be ISPO, which is the International Space Power Organization, which has a regulatory body, which would also have a commercial body that can also provide subsidies or loans or something that can encourage commercial companies to invest in a power grid that you can put on the moon, and then build a power infrastructure and economy on the moon as well. So I think we need to start thinking about that right now, and build a body that would oversee this power organization.
For those of you who know me, you probably know what I'm going to say. There's something that's, to me, like fingernails on a blackboard that I've heard a couple of times, and we need to correct it. We're not going back to the moon. We're going forward to the moon. Back to the moon has a certain connotation. I'm sure you've heard this, been there, done that. Please try to get that out of your vocabulary. We really are going forward. We have a lot of ideas. They've been expressed beautifully this afternoon. And it's not a backward look, it's a forward look. There's a lot to do that's great.
Amen, sister.
Anything you want to?
Start at 8:30.
I think we can wrap up today. We obviously still have questions, but I think we've all learned a lot. So we'll see you on the dark side of the moon.